Hey there, hello, and welcome to Cross's Corner. I'm Martin Cross, and in the corner today is none other than Chris Ahrens. Hi, Chris.
Hi, how are you doing, Martin? Nice to see you.
Yeah, I'm so excited to see you, and I guess some of the more younger of Cross's Corner's viewers might be going, Chris, who? Um, and and um, and if I was to say, okay, Chris, who? How would you describe yourself? How do you describe yourself these days?
Oh gosh, as a rower or just as a person?
Yeah,
I
go
mean,
on.
I
I'm
feel like
interested in
rowing
both.
was
That's
rowing was a long time ago, but I mean, I began rowing when I was. I mean, actually, believe it or not, my father was very into rowing, and so I was dragged down to the boathouse as a little kid, starting when I was like 8 years old, and we would fix boats that had broken, or fix boat racks, or patch the roof of the boathouse, that kind of thing. And so I actually first went out in a little single scull when I was about 8 or 9, and it was tied to the dock with a rope. And so on the stern of the boat there was a rope, and the rope went back to the dock, and my dad would hold onto the rope, and so I would row out, 10 or 15 strokes, or maybe it was less, I don't know. And then he would drag the boat back to the dock, and then I
wow.
would do that again. And but I did that for a little bit, and then I actually got dragged into coxing for a little bit when I was about 12, and because I was still kind of small enough to make it work, and there's always hard to find coxswains in a club, and that was a terrifying experience because I was 12 and I had these 8 grown men. It was early in the morning. They were always a little bit. I mean, they were very kind to me, but you could also tell that I really wasn't doing a very good job. But anyway, that all kind of I kind of got sick of rowing because of that, and I didn't want to have anything to do with it. But then I had some friends who I was on a swim team with in high school, and they wanted to take up rowing, and so they convinced the Milwaukee Rowing Club, which is where I'm from, a small rowing club. Well, it's now bigger and very successful. At the time, very
Yeah.
small. They convinced the club to start a junior program, and so I joined and did that. And then I rowed at Princeton after that, and then I rowed on the U.S. team for 6 years following that, and retired in 2004.
Yeah. How much do you miss it or not?
I miss. I don't miss the activity itself very much. Rowing is hard, as we all know. I think I mean, I live in Brooklyn, New York, and I think if I lived someplace where it was easy to get on the water and go out when I mean, rowing when it's really nice is really wonderful. Flat water and
Yeah.
beautiful scenery, and not a lot of boat traffic, and particularly if you're rowing in a good boat, it can feel great. But the training aspect of it, I feel like I put in enough strokes over the years to leave that behind. What I do really miss, though, is my teammates and the camaraderie and the experience of being together and part of a team. I think that's the thing that everybody that I know who is into rowing,
Yeah.
um, that's why you stick with it, and that's why you enjoy it. It's the part of doing something really hard together, making progress, having some success, having failures, and dealing with those failures. But I think it's also part of the reason that when rowers get together, you meet somebody and you find out they're a rower in some totally different context, and all of a sudden you have this bond, and it's kind of weird. And I think rowing, I don't know that it's like a sport like any other sport, but it is. I do feel like those bonds are a little bit different than other sports, and I don't know why that is, but it's one of those things where as soon as you meet somebody who's a rower, all of a sudden you kind of think, well, okay, this person, is probably pretty tough. They showed up. They didn't have a lot of ego. They were able to get along with a few other people, and it's kind of nice. And so that community, which is a lifelong community, and I would say virtually 80 to 90% of my closest friends are all people I know through rowing. Not necessarily people I rowed with at a super high level, or people that I had a tremendous success with, but people that I met in the context of doing this kind of thing that we did. And so I don't row a lot, but yet rowing is a big part of my life, even though I don't do it all the time.
That's fantastic. And you were very kind enough a couple of years ago or so to mention that you did watch a couple of Cross's Corners and enjoyed them. And I very much felt grateful for you doing that, which is kind of one of the reasons we're chatting now.
Well, it's funny. I mean, I grew up watching the sport as a kid. And then as an athlete, I always wanted to be a student of the sport, and in part because it was a way to get better, but also because I just thought it was interesting. And so, I mean, as an example, Martin, I can't. Maybe you were there, maybe you weren't, but in 1987, my dad and his partner rode the double at Henley, and so I went, and I would have been 11.
Wow.
And I remember Steve Redgrave and Andy Holmes were rowing the pair, and the big showdown was they were going to row against the Pimenoff brothers, who had
Yeah. Yeah.
the Pimenoffs had won, I believe, in '86 in the Worlds, and I think I can't remember if Holmes and Redgrave had won the Cox pair, but anyway, they
Yeah.
were
I
kind of
had.
these two major powers, and there was all this press and all this stuff, and in the end, they basically rode the Soviets to a standstill. I mean, it was kind of they were neck and neck, and then at some point the Pimenovs kind of broke, and they ended up winning by several lengths. But that was the kind of thing that I was into, and even since then, just I've always enjoyed learning about the different people in our sport, the people who are really good ahead of us, and it's interesting because the sport has changed, but it hasn't changed that much. You know, the training's a little different, but if you talk to somebody who rode in the '70s, I mean, I have a lot of friends who rode for the U.S. in the '70s, and they were doing maybe a little bit more intensity, a little bit more interval work, but it's the same kind of dynamics, and also I think a lot of the team stuff is the same in terms of, okay, you have a bad race, how do you recover from that? Or you're going into a particular, you're traveling and you've got to get prepared and somehow figure out how to take on somebody else that's a
Yeah.
big rival. Like all those dynamics are the same. And so it's so fun to watch your show or podcast, whatever we call this, because you have interesting people on who all have interesting experiences. And in some ways, I I feel like you learn something new all the time. And I think
Yeah.
if you don't have that curiosity about our sport, I don't think you're going to get very far. To me, one of the things that really separated the really great rowers from those who are just merely pretty good was, I mean, people can call it athletic intelligence or curiosity or any number of things, but it was people who kind of said, "How do I do this better? And how do I learn from other people? And what is it? Oh, that's interesting. They're doing something different. I don't understand why they're doing that, or they're doing something different. It seems to be working for them." And that's fascinating. And also, I think the other interesting thing is that, I mean, you look at people talk about technique, you know, and for a
Yeah.
long time they used to have these like, oh, this is the national technique of Germany, or this is how all the
Yeah.
Australians row, or the Italians. There's like, oh, they all got coached by Giuseppe Lamora, so they row this way. And I think there's some of that, but the interesting thing was then you line all these boats up who supposedly row totally differently, and they all end up within, you know, 2 seconds
Yeah.
of each other at the end of the race. And so clearly there are different ways to skin this cat. And a little bit of it, I always felt like was figuring out how does our crew or whatever crew you're working with kind of figure out the technique that works for them. And I also think there's a difference. It's funny, people talk about technique and style. They usually talk about technique, but I remember chatting with Harry Parker once, and we were talking about, you know, he said there's technique and then there's style. Technique is that you put the blade in the water the correct way, or that
Yeah.
you, when you finish the stroke, you know, your blade comes out cleanly, you don't wash out. Technique is that, you know, the that, you know, you aren't skying the blade, or the boat's not
Yeah.
going like this. Style is, oh, I have a slight pause at the finish, or we open the back a little earlier, or, you know, whatever it is. And I think so many times in our sport we confuse style and technique. But anyway, all these things are fun to learn about and talk about.
Yeah. That was fascinating. Great answer too. Just on that 87 Henley, I wasn't competing there, but I was up by the side of the course, and there was a canoe that came out when the Pimenovs were leading. Like this was after about 900 meters, and the Pimenovs were leading Redgrave and Holmes, and a canoe came out, and it like hit and stopped Redgrave and Holmes, and Andy Holmes punched the canoe, and the Pimenovs stopped, and they were gesturing like Yuri, who's not alive now, God bless him, but he was
Yeah.
doing like this to come back to Redgrave and Holmes, like, you know,
Yeah, yeah, let's even
we'll
this up.
stop the race, let's even this up. So a great example of sportsmanship. But in terms of so you were coached by the great Mike Teti, not just on the national team, but also at Princeton. What would Mike say about technique and style?
I think he would say something similar. I mean, I think that it would be interesting. It would be interesting to ask him that question, and it would be interesting to ask him that question over the years, because I think many coaches start out, I don't know. I mean, I think all coaches go crazy. I mean, every single friend I have who has become a coach goes a little bit crazy, because I think you're relying on usually people way younger than you who are pretty immature to determine like the entire value of your life's work. And I'm sure that's a very challenging existence. But I, I think a lot of coaches start out and they have a very kind of set idea of, well, this is what works, and this is the way it should be. And then I think many of them, the successful ones, over time realize that, okay, I need to both evolve my own understanding of the sport and evolve with how we learn more about training and learn more about technique, but also I need to evolve the way that I think about combining how I coach the boat with the athletes themselves. Because I think you look at different athletes, and I think different athletes are going to respond to different kinds of training. They're going to respond to different technique. And so Mike early on had he was always a very, you can call it strict or very tough or very prescriptive coach.
Mm.
But early on, he was we spent a lot of time on blade work. And it was a very kind of, I think, Tor Nielsen to Chris Korzanowski kind of Italian style of technique. And then I think he kind of morphed and changed that a little bit and allowed, in some ways, the athletes to influence the technique a little bit. So, I mean, for example, when I started rowing for Mike, I was 18. I was a freshman at Princeton, 1994. And, it was very clear who was in charge, and it was very clear that we as athletes were not going to, contribute much to that discussion. At the same time, by 2004, 10 years later, obviously at a different level, rowing on the national team, the Olympic team, there was a fair amount of give and take. And I think a lot of our style in that crew was driven by Brian Volpenhein style, who ended up being the stroke. And I think it was interesting. I think Mike, having kind of gotten punched in the face in 2000 a little bit,
Yeah.
I think some coaches might have either crumpled or kind of doubled down on their what in their mind had been working. And Mike, to his credit, evolved and really changed a lot of the way that he operated. He was still the same person, but instead of rowing mainly in eights, a little bit in fours, we rowed in pairs all the time. Instead of the training have changed a little bit, the technique changed a little bit, all these things, and also there was much more give and take between the athletes and Mike, and I think that, and I would guess that if you talk to veteran coaches who've been around a long time, even ones who are tough and who are supposedly autocratic,
Yeah.
I would think that they start that is a key element of how they think about things.
God, there's so many ways that I could go after that response. What I'm kind of going to go to you at Princeton as an 18-year-old. I know you'd done juniors, and I know you hadn't won a medal. So were you, as a freshman, were you straight in Mike's Princeton first day? And I'm kind of
yeah. So
go on.
I had an interesting thing. So I grew up rowing in Milwaukee. All these guys, there was 8 of us on the team, and so we had 8 and 8, and then 6 of those guys were a year older than I was, and so when they when they graduated high school, there were only 2 of us left, and so we ended up rowing in singles and doubles and pairs and things like that. But I kind of showed up to the junior national team tryouts, and I think I was in the mix, but I certainly wasn't one of the top athletes. And I ended up for a little while, I was stroking the 8, the junior 8, which was the top crew. And then we got to Freiburg, Germany, and for whatever reason, the coaches thought it wasn't working. And so I ended up moving into the Cox 4. which was the second boat. And interestingly enough, the other people on that Cox 4 were a guy named Matt Carlson, who I ended up rowing for 3 years at Princeton with, who was a national team member, under 23 world champion. Paul Teti, who is Mike's little brother.
Yeah.
It was ended up rowing at Princeton with him for various reasons. We ended up rowing together only 1 year, but won a national championship. Then Paul was on 3 Olympic teams. And the other guy was a guy named Bill Plifka, who ended up being a lightweight world champion. And so it's kind of an interesting thing that all of us ended up, going on to have some amount of success. But we had a fun time, and because it was a little bit, I wouldn't say thrown together at the end, but it was kind of like at the last second we all got put in this boat. We ended up winning the semifinal, and then we kind of at the final didn't work, and whatever. But we got fourth. And then the weird thing was that I arrived at Princeton, and I think I weighed 175 pounds. I don't know what that is in stone. You'll have to do that translation. But and then somehow I started shaving, and I went through puberty and Mike's training. And by the end of that season, so just a year later, having rowed at Princeton as a freshman, and there was freshman rowing, so you couldn't row in the top crew. You had to row as a freshman. Ended up. Mike said, "Well, why don't you come? We're putting together this kind of development camp, and we're going to create a Cox 4 out of that. And why don't you come to that?" And I didn't. That was kind of a shock to me that I would be included in that. But I thought, okay. And there was another teammate of mine named Marty Crotty, who was very good, who also came along to that camp.
I know Marty.
Yeah, of course. Yeah, you guys share a first name. No, but at any rate, I ended up making that Cox 4. And then we ended up winning the world championship. So it was this weird kind of thing. And the guys that I was in that Cox 4 with, 2 of them, I spent, years rowing with, and are 2 of my closest friends, Ben Holbrook and Porter Collins, and still to this day are my closest friends. And then another guy named Scott Munn, who was kind of this veteran guy at like 24, who we thought was like 50, who had rowed in the 92 Olympics, and he was kind of the leader of our group. And then Pete Chiplone, who was our coxswain and who was my coxswain for a long time. So it was this odd thing where I went from kind of the fringes of the junior team and kind of not having a lot of success, and then a year later winning the senior world championships in the 4 at age 18, Cox 4. And we rowed against this Kiwi 4 that had 2 guys who had been part of those. Yeah, exactly. Chris White. And I forget the other, maybe it was just Chris White, but he had been in those great Kiwi 8s. And then I think he'd also won a bronze medal maybe in '88 in the straight 4.
Yeah.
And so we had a very close race with them in both the heat and the final. And so it was kind of that was an interesting thing to reflect on, just the year of change. And a lot of that was because rowing for Mike at Princeton was very, very challenging. There were times when you thought, like, I don't know if I'm going to make it through this week, let alone the season. But some of that was also kind of shifting from being a junior rower and being a kid to being a grown-up. And I think what Mike did more than any other coach that I know, although I'm sure there are other coaches like this out there, was he would take kids and athletes who had never won anything and never really had a lot of success, and somehow after they had been rowing for him, they thought that they should win everything, and that they were confident, and they, and that, I think, and some of it was that you kind of felt like, if I can make it through the like maelstrom, the psychological maelstrom of rowing for this guy, like what else can they do to me? But it was also, I think that you felt like when he said something to you, he was being honest. Like if he ever gave you a compliment, which wasn't that often, but like it was a real compliment. So when oddly enough, like you would start to have success. And so that for me was my journey in that particular time in my career. But I watched other athletes have similar evolutions under Mike. And and it wasn't easy, and it wasn't necessarily fun all the time, but it was fascinating to see that happen.
Yeah. So I know Mike, maybe not as well as you, but I was very close to Mike, and I was writing Olympic Obsession around about the time that you're talking about there, and he would talk about people he was coaching at Princeton. And I say this because Steve Gladstone has said, you've kind of you kind of have this relationship. You almost love the oarsman that you're coaching. And he would talk about you in like special tones about this kid, Chris Ahrens, and about his abilities and, just how incredible he thought that you were. I wonder if you got any sense of that's what he thought of you, because that's my sense of, looking back on it now.
Yeah, I mean, I was treated, I was lucky for whatever reason. I think there were a couple parts of that. First, I generally did what Mike said to do. I think, um, and I know that sounds a little funny, but I think so many times, I was a good athlete in the sense that if Mike said, "Here's what I want you to do," I would do that. Um, I think, and so I think he appreciated that. I, for whatever reason, I was pretty good at rowing. I don't know why. I think that we spend a lot of time talking about how hard somebody works or this or that or the other thing. I mean, it's interesting to me when I was a swimmer, we would talk about certain athletes and you just say, oh, well, they're just really good. But in rowing, we don't talk like that. We always kind of have this thing of like, oh, well, what's their training program, or they're doing this. And so I would love to say it was because I worked hard, or I mean, I think I had some, for whatever reason, I had some gifts in rowing. And I think I showed up to practice. I tried to work as hard as I could in practice, but I also got lucky. And I think that, but I think that my theory was always, Mike was tough on people, and it wasn't always that he was tough on the group, but then people would get singled out for special attention. And I think sometimes it was very calculated. I think Mike, with certain guys, thought, okay, I know how to get this guy motivated, or I know how to get him to do what I want him to do. And but if you were on the receiving end of that could be pretty unpleasant, or it could feel challenging. I think for whatever reason, early on, he realized or that direct approach with me wasn't going to be as effective as kind of the indirect approach. But for whatever reason, I was lucky in that I rarely got singled out, and I rarely got kind of put into the torture chamber, so to speak, even though that wasn't a reflection of me as an athlete. I think other guys who were better than I am would get, people talk about Alec Ferguson's blow dryer or whatever it was. But so, and then the other thing was, like, we had a lot of success together. I mean, and it was funny because I remember in 2005, the 8 won and was really fast 8, US 8. Now it was the first year after the Olympics. Okay, it's a little different, but I mean, they basically switched out like 2 guys. Me and Joey came out of the 04 8, and they put in 2 different guys, both of whom were great rowers. And I think they went even faster in practice and stuff. But I remember calling Mike and kind of joking, like, well, this is the first time you've won without me. And that was a pure joke. I would never have said anything to him like that when I was rowing. But all that is to say, like, we had a lot of success. I think Mike trusted me as an athlete because he had seen me as an 18-year-old and a 19-year-old and a 20-year-old and all those things. And I think that we also, I knew what he expected, and I think he knew that I would show up and perform. And I think so many times, as a coach, I'm guessing that, I'm just thinking about this now, I'm guessing that having an athlete that you know what you're going to get is actually probably pretty valuable, as opposed to the stress of having an athlete that you're like, oh my God, well, this person could either be lights out great tonight, or they could be, a complete flop.
Yeah, yeah,
But yeah, anyway, no, I mean, but I've always had, it's funny. I mean, Mike and I don't talk that often, but when we do, it feels like no time has gone by. And he was a huge influence on my life and a huge mentor to me. And it was, and I think but I don't think that relationship is necessarily unique. I mean, I think he's been that person for a lot of people.
yeah. It was interesting while you were talking. You mentioned earlier about your great friend Porter Collins, and Mike told me a story about coaching Porter, which I put in Olympic Obsession, and it was at the end of the lake at Princeton. I think it was, you maybe had a couple of eights, and sort of, I think Porter was saying something at the end of a piece, and Mike kind of said, what's that you said, Porter? And it was like, oh, nothing. And he goes, yeah, you said something. Yeah, what was it? And nudging the boat over, I've got all fucking day. I could,
Yeah.
And the kind of thing was, I think it ended with, I think Porter sort of said something like, well, I was saying, let's get a little bit more out of it, and, and he's like, so Mike's saying, so you telling Chris Ahrens he's not trying hard enough? Are you saying to Bob Kaler, just put a bit more in there? The next time
I mean, but that was classic Mike, because he knew that then the next piece, Porter would be like a caged animal. And I think, but Porter's an example of a guy who, I think if you ask Mike, well, who are some of the best people I've ever coached? I mean, I think he would put Porter in that conversation, and Porter deserves to be in that conversation. But, and I think Porter, he brought such great energy to a group. He was always positive. In addition to being a great athlete, he was always positive. He was always a great guy who you knew had your back. And he was a fighter. I mean, I think that was one thing that Mike really appreciated in somebody, was that he didn't really care if they were that good at rowing in some ways. And he didn't really care if they were technically that proficient, but if they were a fighter, if they tried hard, if they got knocked down and got back up, like that really was important to him. And I think he kind of felt like, if they have that, then I can kind of help them figure out the other parts of it. But I also think, I mean, it's funny because I remember that another Porter Collins story is we were all rowing, and then they would have these big groups where we would have, I don't know, 100 guys would show up, and it would be the under 23 team, and everybody was trying out for different groups, and then we'd be a lot of racing. And I remember there was one guy who showed up, and he was a big guy with like lots of muscles, and he had a big tattoo on his back. And are we allowed to swear a little bit? I don't know how that
yeah, okay.
That's cool. But so this guy, and he was a good guy. There was nothing wrong with him, but we're out rowing, and all of a sudden Mike starts going, you know what? Do you think Porter Collins is scared of you because you have a big tattoo and you say fuck a lot? He's not fucking scared of you. Like, it was just like, but that was classic Mike. Like, it was kind of just, and again, that was, I'm sure, designed because he thought, well, how do I get this guy like pumped up and ready to go? And also, in a way, it was, I think one thing that was true about rowing for Mike was there was no one, and maybe I was the exception, I don't know, like no one was safe. And so everybody was equal. And whether, if you went out in the group in mixed boats and you were showing up for the first time to practice, you might sit there and watch Mike berate a 3-time world champion about, something. Like, it was not. And so in a way, it evened the playing field. And I think everybody kind of came together because you were all going through this experience. But it also meant that if you were somebody new or somebody who was not kind of quote unquote a veteran, I don't know that you certainly didn't feel like, oh, this guy, like, I don't have a chance. I think everybody felt like they had a chance. I don't know.
Yeah. So 3 back-to-back world titles. How do you explain that? 98, 97, 98, 99 in the men's A.
I mean, I think the I think we had a special group of athletes in terms of mentality. Um, I think that there was each of us in our own way, like wasn't perfect, but I think every person that was part of that group, and there's more than 8 people because the lineup changed a little bit, but
Mm.
everybody was a really good racer and a very kind of when put under pressure was very tough and very um, and I think the mentality of the group kind of grew from there. I mean, it was building off a great base in some ways, in that through the 90s the US had a fair amount of success under Spracklen, and there was some
Yeah.
and we had some of that, in that a couple of the guys from that group came into our group and I think brought some veteran leadership. But I think that it was a mentality of that, again, oddly enough, it was this sense, there was no, we weren't afraid of anything. And I think, and we kind of expected to win, not because we were arrogant, but I think because we just thought, well, why not? Why shouldn't we? We're putting in the training, we're putting in the effort. And I think that um, and if you look back, you know, okay, we won 3 world championships, but I think the combined winning margin in those 3 world championships of all 3 races was like a second and a half. I
Was
mean,
it?
it's not like, or I don't know, maybe it was 2 seconds, but they were all reasonably close races, even ones that, like 98, I felt like we had control of that race for most of the race, but 97 and 99 were very close races and very tight.
Romania and Great Britain, wasn't it?
Yeah, and I think these are, but I also think that's the story of rowing, but it's also the story of life. Like you win, I was chatting with Dick Cashin, who was a great rower for the U.S. in the '70s and rowed at Oxford,
Yeah.
and the other day on Thursday, and or on Friday, I guess, whatever it was, um, and uh, and we were both laughing because we're saying, like, you win, like when you win by this much, like in that, but not just in rowing, but in all of life, and so you you train really hard, and you try and put yourself in a position to have success, and then you hope that you get a little bit lucky, and you hope that the effort you put in
Yeah.
uh puts gets to the right place. And so there's no question that in that period we had a little bit of luck, but we also, I think we put ourselves in position to have good luck. And I think so many times when you watch a race, it's always interesting to me because you watch a final, and within 400 meters, 250 meters, there's 3 crews that are going to compete for the win.
Yeah.
And oftentimes it's like 2,
Yeah.
by the time you cross 1,000 meters, half the boats are, they're just done. And not because I think some of that's the nature of our sport, and some of it's just the way that it works. And so, like, I think the whole job of all the training and all the effort and all that stuff is to put yourself into that 2 or 3 crews, and then you hope that at that moment, you can pull something out of the bag and go deep enough into the well to be able to take on these other people. But a lot of that too, then, I think, does come down to mentality. Are you prepared to go until they break? Or a lot of times they aren't going to break, and so you just have to keep going and going and going. And some of that is doing it over and over again. I think the stress that Mike put us under in practice, I think some of this was by design and some of it just happened. Like the stress of rowing in the world championships was, okay, it's a little more stressful, but certainly wasn't like a new experience.
Yeah.
And I think there was a toughness that we all had from kind of going through this that I think really served us well when it came to competing. And we'd all raced a lot. I think in eights, we'd raced a lot in college. We didn't race a lot internationally, which was a bummer, but we'd all been in close races. It wasn't like, oh, I'm down a half a length with 600 meters to go. What's this like? What's going to happen? It's like, no, I've done this before, a bunch of times. Or it's coming down to the last 40 strokes, and I wonder what this is going to be like. No, that's not something new. And so I think that all helped us. And I think if we had been able to race a little bit more internationally, maybe we would have done a little better. I don't know. Who knows?
Yeah. What 2000 was kind of like a screw up or a mess up. I mean, if ever an Olympic medal had a name on it, you would have thought the USA men's A would have that. Maybe we can talk about that and what happened, but I was thinking about it in the context of, do you think if you hadn't have screwed up there, that you wouldn't have won the gold medal in 2004?
I mean, I think the obvious, yes. I think the answer is yes. Um, I think so much changed between those two. It'd be interesting if you were to take the two programs that, under the same coach between
Mm.
2000 and 2004 and laid them out. You would have said, well, these are two totally different approaches, in terms of the training, in terms of the selection, in terms of the kind of the racing ahead of time. I think 2000, I'm sure everybody has their own story of what happened in 2000, all the people who were part of that group. Um, and those are all true. And they're all different. But I think part of the challenge when you do have success, we'd had success for these 3 years, you develop a confidence that says, well, okay, we've had a setback. Well, we've had setbacks before, like
Mm.
we've had a challenge, we've had challenges before, we can overcome it. And I think it, there was, if you look back in retrospect, you can line up a whole series of things that were really challenging that and I'm not talking about, we had multiple injuries. We had, the boathouse where we were training, we got kicked out of because they were redoing the boathouse. So all of a sudden we were in a different thing. We had an influx of, we had this whole situation where the straight four hadn't qualified. And so they
Yeah.
had to do that. I mean, there's all kinds of things going on. And I think, again, you win and lose by this much. So can you overcome 3 of those things? Yes, but can you overcome 5? I don't know. What's the number? And I think the interesting thing is every great crew, even the crews that win, have those challenges. It's never a march like to greatness without any wrinkle along the way. And I actually think one of the interesting things for me about the experience of 2000 was it was very searing, and it was a terrible experience, and one that totally turned me off rowing and turned me off the Olympics. And for me, going back in '04 was really about getting that out of my system so that I could actually go back and participate in the rowing world. Because after 2000, anytime that I encountered rowing or encountered the Olympics, it was just it made me feel really shitty. And so I didn't want to do
Yeah.
that anymore. But one thing that was really interesting is I remember after that coming back in the fall, in 2000, sitting in a room, and I watched this Gold Fever documentary series
Oh,
about,
yeah.
which was a great series, and I think it was kind of just before everybody realized that, like, if you're really candid on video, like the world, everybody sees it and it's remembered forever. But as a result, like the guys in that crew, who were, I would say, kind of the stars of the regatta, or the stars of the rowing world. Like they were incredibly candid. And I think what was really interesting to me as an athlete was from afar, before social media really took over and
Mm.
before you knew a lot, it was kind of like, oh, well, these guys, this is Steve Redgrave and Matthew Pinsett, who walk on water and who are, who I'm sure every training session is just incredible, and this and that and the other thing. And you just didn't know, there's a lot of mystery. And you watch this and you realize, like, oh my gosh, like they're just having problem after problem. It's like, turns out Steve Redgrave has diabetes. It turns out this is
Yeah.
happening. Somebody
Yeah.
gets injured. Like things are going really poorly. And I thought, wow, like, okay, it's different. They're different. I'm not comparing myself to them, but like they're encountering a lot of the same problems I've encountered
Yeah.
as an athlete. And like, lo and behold, like, that's just normal, and you have to overcome those things. And so, it was, in a way, it was heartening. And it informed a little bit of how I approached things in '04. In that, I think coming out of 2000, we were 2000. I think one of the unfortunate things about it was it kind of shattered the cohesiveness of that group. And so
Yeah.
'04 was like a totally different group of people with the exception of me and Brian. And I really came into that group late. I mean, I showed up in the fall of 2003, and um, it just had a totally different kind of psychology and personality, and and a lot of that reflected what Mike had done in terms of how he had changed, but
Mm.
a huge amount of it reflected Brian Volpenhein and Joey Hansen and the other guys in the group who and their kind of personalities and leadership, and so the crews in some ways, like all those guys, I both in the late '90s group and in the '04 group, there's a lot of similarities, but the dynamics of the crew were totally different. And the intensity that we had in those kind of late '90s group was, and the killer attitude and kind of aggressiveness. '04 was almost I also was in a different position. I had gone from being kind of a core part of the group who was, consistent member of
Yeah.
that team to kind of a new person who had to meld in and like become part of this new thing. And that was challenging for me at first. I mean, I'd been stroking for a long time, for years and years and years. Every time you go out, you're in the stroke
Yeah.
seat. All of a sudden, then you go to a different seat, and it's like, wow, like this is different, And you have to follow somebody, and not just follow them. I mean, it's one thing to be, you know, following, but it's another thing to actually be in the rhythm and to understand what they're trying to do with the stroke and trying. And it took me, I would argue it might have taken me until like a month before the Olympics
Wow.
to really figure out like how to meld into this group and how to row with Brian and his rhythm. Um, and and in some ways, I also realized like when you're stroking, you can kind of do whatever you want. Like you can row the way you want, you can row
Yeah.
whatever rating you want, and if you want to go crazy and go bananas, you can. Um, when you're kind of in the middle of the boat, or like you can't be as individualized. Like you have to kind of fit into what they're doing, and in some ways that means you can't go as hard. Like you have to expend your energy in a different way.
Yeah.
Like you have
Yeah.
to expend your energy within the rhythm in the as it affects the crew positively. But if you try to individually just take over, then you kind of screw everything up. Whereas in a lot of times in the stroke seat, I mean, that's your job, is to take over individually. Like when the race is on the line,
Yeah.
your
Yeah.
job
Yeah.
is to create impulse, to create the the spark to make a change. And that's the interesting thing when when there's 500 meters to go and you're down to two seats and you need to make a change. As the stroke seat, like you have to initiate that change. You have to
Yeah.
be the driver. If you do that and you're sitting somewhere in the back of the boat and you just decide, well, I'm going to initiate change, well, then like that's a problem. And I know that sounds like kind of foo-foo and a little bit weird, but it's interesting mentally that took me a bit to figure out.
Yeah. One thing briefly, because I've got so many questions. You obviously working, I guess, on Wall Street, and from 2000 to 2003, the fall of. So I heard your firm made you a partner to make sure you came back because they thought you were such a great guy. And I'm just wondering, did you train? Like, were you on the machine all the time, or how did you keep fit?
So so first of all, I was lucky because I worked for Dick Cashin, who had been a rower, and Dick had his own version, I think, of 2000, which was that in '76, the U.S. won the World Championships in the '8 and '74. Um, beautiful crew, which won by a length. And and then they had some success in '75, and going into '76, they I think were thought that things were going to go really well, and they had their like all kinds of things happened to them, and that's its own saga, but they didn't do well.
Mm.
And so then Mike kept rowing, and in 1980 he was part of a great U.S. crew that obviously but didn't get a chance to
Didn't
row at the
get chance.
Olympics.
Yeah.
And so I think I was very lucky in that of all the people to be working for, he was very sympathetic when I went. What happened was I remember, I was working really hard initially after 2000, 80 hours a week, 98 hours a week. And that was, you couldn't really train, and I didn't really want to train. But then at some point, I mean, I think I got out of the shower and looked in the mirror and I was like, wow, like this is not good. We've gone from like, something to something a lot worse. And so I thought, well, I better like start exercising again. And, and so I was training, and then I kind of, if I'm gonna put an hour of exercise in every day, I might as well see if I can get fit again. And at the same time, the US eight, kind of in that early 2000s, was doing pretty well. They were winning medals. Canada had some fantastic crews through that period. Mike
Mm.
Spracklen had gone up there, and they were doing really well. But the US eight was right there, and I had this moment where I just thought, well, gosh, if these guys go to the Olympics and win a medal, and I'm sitting here on the side, like it's really going to bother me.
Mm.
And not because I thought I could make the crew. I knew that experience would be hard for me. And so I thought I'm going to give this one last shot. I'm going to see if I can get into shape. And then if I can get into shape, I'll see if Dick will give me some time. And it was kind of step by step. And if that happens, then I'll call Mike and see if I can go back.
Yeah.
And so I went. I remember I had lunch with Dick, and I said, and you don't normally call your boss and say, hey, can we go have lunch together? And I remember he said something like, his first line was like, how much is this going to cost me? Meaning, like, I think he thought I was going to ask him for, money for a charity or something. And I said, well, I don't know, maybe it cost you, but I was hoping I could go back and train again. But so for the fall of that year, I just commuted back and forth to New York.
Mm.
And then I took some time off once we got going in San Diego and other times. But I was very lucky that he was so supportive, and it was also, in a weird way, I was in a very different position, because I think most people, you finish the Olympics and it's kind of like, well, what do I do now? And I knew I was just going back to work. Like I kind of had this whole life that I had stepped
Yeah.
out of. And so that was just a different kind of thing. But
Yeah. You've talked a lot about Brian Volpenhein. I know there's some great stories about him. I mean, I'd like to know what was particularly special about him. I know one of the stories which I find fascinating is the warm up that you did before the final, or didn't do before the final, because I
yeah,
think. What can you say about that?
well, I think, I mean, Brian, I met Brian in 1997. Brian was trying out for um, the like under 23 team, and he'd rowed at Ohio State, which at the time was not a particularly strong club. And but he showed up and he was doing well, and then he got hurt, and so he didn't end up rowing. I can't remember how he got hurt, but it was enough that he was out for the rest of the season. But then in 98 and 99 and 2000, Brian was on the team, but he was in the bow seat, and he was kind of a quiet guy who, I wouldn't he was hugely, he contributed hugely as an athlete, but
Mm.
um, he was not front and center in terms of the kind of psychology, the psychology of the group. And he was beloved, but he wasn't imprinting his personality on the crew. And I think he was also, in some ways, perhaps, I don't know, I've never talked to them about it, but I'm guessing initially he was kind of like, okay, I just want to like fit in and
Mm.
not make too many waves, and not draw too much attention to myself. And then all of a sudden, after 2000, he was kind of like the only guy who kept going. Or a few guys. There were a few guys, but
Mm.
and then they started rowing in the pairs more. And I think he started to do well in the pairs. And I think he started to figure out some stuff himself about his own philosophy about rowing. And I think he also started to develop his own confidence about himself and confidence about his attitude, and competing. And and I think Brian, in his own way, was always very curious as well. I mean, I think
Yeah.
he took a lot from Tim McLaren, who happened to be around. James Tompkins was over for a little bit coaching in the U.S., oddly enough, for like this sabbatical of some sort. And I think they spent a lot of time together, and he took a lot from James. And I think, and from everywhere. he really developed into a more complete oarsman over that period. And so when I showed back up in '04, like we had remained friends and we'd hang out and
Yeah.
talk occasionally, but it was a different person as an athlete. And I think Brian didn't like training that much. But he was kind of naturally quite good. And I think he also kind of had a sense of, well, this training works for me. And so that's what, and I think that's actually really important as an athlete to figure out what training works for you, because it is so different. I mean, I think and I think certain kinds of things, certain people need different stuff in order to perform at their best. And I think Brian, by that point, had figured out kind of, this is what I need to do my best. And I also think he was, in my opinion, that year, he was the best rower in the world.
Oh,
I think
wow.
I think just individually, I mean, I don't know for a fact, and I'm sure there's people who would debate that, but in '04, I felt like he was so good. I mean, he had power and technique and racing ability. And I think that he also had confidence in a way that I think he had not maybe in the past. And I think,
Mm.
and certainly winning the four in Lucerne that year, and I just think he was operating at the very peak of his ability. And it was also the first time he got moved into being in the stroke seat, I think.
Yeah.
And whether that was because Mike didn't like him in the stroke seat, or because it was almost like Brian didn't want to be in the stroke seat, but all of a sudden it was like, no, I'm ready to take on this
Yeah.
kind of mantle of leadership. And so it was very easy to say, well, this guy's very good, and like, how do we, I remember talking with somebody, a coach, and they were saying, well, like, you're talking about selection. Maybe it was a panel. And they said, selection's very easy. You take your best guy and you put him in stroke seat. And then, like, you put, like,
Uh,
basically, you kind of fill out everything else behind that. And I think that's, if you look around, that's kind of broadly how it works. I mean, okay, sometimes in the pair, people do different things or whatever it is. But, and I think that was very much, that became Brian's crew in a way that I think the other crews weren't necessarily that way. And so, like, the racing and the warm up story and all that, I think that was all true, and yet at the same time, it wasn't like a shock. It wasn't
yeah.
like, oh my God, like, we've had one way of doing things and now we're doing something different. Like, part of Brian's personality and part of the whole personality of that crew is almost to be like very loose and very
Mm.
kind of fun and easy. And then when it was time to go, to switch on and be really, really locked in. But when it wasn't, we would kind of, and it drove Mike crazy, because his whole life as an athlete and as a coach was kind of like, how you do anything is how you do everything. And so, like, if you're paddling, it should be great paddling. And if you
Yeah.
are doing steady state, it should be perfect. And like, whereas, we would go out and row, and we were kind of like, well, we're just kind of like rowing. And so we didn't care. But I think it drove him nuts, because he's like, well, this could be so much better. Why aren't you? But I think, in a way, what we realized as a crew was that it was almost like a mental break. It allowed that mental break of being a little looser
Mm.
and being a little bit more relaxed, kind of allowed some of the guys to be that much more locked in when it came time to be
Yeah.
ready to go. It did present challenges, I think, internally. It never was a problem, because I think we all dealt with it. But, like, my personality was probably more like, hey, like, if we're gonna go out and row, like, let's have it be good, or let's focus on not fooling around, and not, okay, like, we can joke a little bit, but, like,
Yeah.
there's a limit to that. And I think where people draw the line on that limit is different. And but I think I think one thing about the group, and I think this is probably true of all great crews, like, everybody has their own ego, and it's a huge ego, because otherwise you wouldn't be at that level. You wouldn't have been selfish enough to, like, say, I'm going to kind of make everybody else change their life so I get to do what I want as a rower. But I think we also all kind of deferred to the group. And even Brian, and even other strong personalities in the crew, like, everybody kind of said, well, what is it? The first thing was, well, what do I need to do to make sure everybody else can do well? And I think that ultimately, in my experience, is like what makes any good team work, and particularly in rowing.
Yeah.
So
Um, the race I remember really, not so much the final from that Olympics, was, USA and Canada, which was ridiculous because in the heat, because of the seeding system or lack of it. The world champions up against
yeah.
the other top crew. I mean, it was a hell of a race. What do you remember about that?
Well, it was interesting because I think at the beginning, first of all, we were untested. I mean, we were the fourth seed, but we had never rowed together as a crew, and fair enough. Like, I think, and I remember before that, the race, Mike being kind of miffed that we were racing the Canadians. And I remember I kind of said, well, no, this is good. I'm excited. Like, I want to test ourselves against these guys. Like, I want to see where we are relative to them, because if they're the best crew, like I'd rather go out and race them in the heat and then know what this is going to be like, because
Yeah,
we're going to have to race them again in the final, as opposed to having somehow getting to the final and then being like, oh, well, what's this going to be like? And I think we knew that they were going to be very good, and they were very good. It was a blazing tailwind with relatively kind of challenging conditions, and we weren't a great tailwind crew, or relative to other. That would probably be our weakness as a crew, would be racing in the tailwind. But we also knew we'd done a lot of rowing in tailwinds and in crappy water, because that course in
yeah,
Skimyass, was notorious for having these just rolling white caps down in that one direction. And but I remember it was interesting. Again, I think this shows a little bit of the looseness of the crew. We we warmed up, and we got into the starting area, and we were, I think, getting ready to do like a practice start, or maybe we were actually had even like gotten onto the locked into the starting gate there, and we were taking some clothes off or doing whatever it was, and I looked over and I saw Ed Hewitt was there, and Ed is the guy who
yeah,
runs Road 2K. But also Ed was married to Lori Daphne, who was the rowing coach at Princeton, and I'd known Ed since I was a freshman in college, and all of us kind of knew Ed, and so I don't know, I just thought, well, hey, there's Ed, I'll say hello. And I said, hey Ed, how you doing? Like, what's going on? And then Ed was like, I think Ed was a little bit like, well, what? He was a little bit shocked, but he kind of said, hey, and everybody was chatting, and then I don't even know, we might even like, he might, talked about the weather. I don't know. It wasn't like just a hello. We talked a little bit, but I think that was a little bit, that was the way that crew was. It was kind of like, yeah, we're just here. We're going to do this piece. And then it was like, okay, now it's time to get going. And we immediately were locked in. We ended up rowing that race. I think we knew they were going to be fast really early. And we knew that the whole job was to kind of stay close enough so that in the second part of the race we could come through, because historically they had gotten out and they would get out to 3/4 of a length lead, and then it would kind of close up, but there was never, the US
yeah,
would run out of race course, and so you'd lose by 2 seats at the end. And so I think it was always the thing was, let's just keep this close enough that to give ourselves a chance in the last 750 meters. And luckily, I think for whatever reason, like, we were close enough. It was a back and forth battle. And again, here's another example of like the personality of this crew. I mean, I remember with about 600 meters to go, the water's getting really kind of crappy. It's a close race. Maybe we're up a seat, down a seat. I don't know, very close. And all of a sudden I just hear JR say something like, I got the set, you guys can go. I mean, it's like, what? And you're kind of like, but not like gasping for breath, not like I'm near blackout. This was like as though he was rowing, like we were rowing steady state. And he's just like, hey, by the way, guys, like, I got this, now you guys can really turn it on. But I think that in a way that was normal. It was normal that JR would be saying something like that. And so we ended up winning that. And I think that gave us a lot of confidence. And I think it also, but I remember we sat down after that race, and that was on a Sunday, and I think the final was that was on a Monday, and the final was on a Sunday or something. There was a long time in between the races. And I remember I sat down and I was encouraged. I thought, like, we have a chance to win this. But like lots of crews have won the heat and then not won the Olympics. Like that was almost a pattern. But I thought we have a chance. Like we're one of those 2 or 3 crews that's in the mix. You know, when I was talking earlier about how, okay, in the final you have 6 crews, but really it's only 1 or 2. Like that gave me, and I remember sitting with the guys and I said, guys, like we have an opportunity like this, and this is like a once in a lifetime opportunity. And so like we've got 5 days or 6 days, like we got to figure out how to not, you know, like we got to stay locked in. We got to be focused. And then it was interesting because during that, in between those periods, like there were a bunch of days you couldn't row because the course was closed. It was, but then we had a few great rows, and we would always go out the night before the final. Historically, we would be kind of on the course toward the end of the session, and usually it would be us, and oftentimes it would be the Italian quad. I don't know why, but it would just be those 2 crews out there rowing around. And usually, I just remember almost every year, you know, but certainly the years where we won, those were always like these magical rows. And I'm sure other good crews have had that, where you're all the training that you've put in, you're rested, like you're rowing at your peak, and you go out and you have this kind of easy row with a few bursts, or you practice some starts. And those are great memories for me of this kind of the quiet, the course would be quiet, the water would be flat, and you'd go out and you'd have those kind of ecstatic experiences where you say like, oh my God, we just did 20 strokes that were, you know, close to perfection, or as close as we can get to perfection. And so I think we had one of those great rows that night before. And so then the next day when we came down and Brian didn't want to do a lot of warm up, it was kind of like, well, yeah, like we don't need a lot of warm up. We're fine. You know, so I don't know, those are my memories from that. I'm sure other guys could spark more other memories if they were sitting here talking about it.
Has it made any difference to you in your professional life being an Olympic champion, or was the dice already cast, you know, things already ordained for you as to how it would go?
Yeah, I mean, it's not something I talk about a lot. I'm sure it's something that, you know, the first line in my obituary has already been written, you know, in the sense that I think that is how you become identified, whether you like it or not. It's funny because it's not something, I mean, I'm proud of my rowing experience, but I'm more proud of that hopefully that people thought of me as a good teammate, or that people thought of me as somebody who was like a reasonable person to have in the group. I always felt lucky to row with guys who were better than I was. And therefore you get better. And so I feel like being an Olympic champion, I'm sure there's probably, you know, some meeting that I've gotten because of that. But I think more than anything, the experience of rowing, and not necessarily even at the Olympics, I think the experience of rowing in college, the experience of rowing at a reasonably high level, was huge for me in my life, because I think you start out rowing, and particularly, I think the ergometer, interestingly enough, which really isn't rowing, but you know, you start out and you row the ergometer, and then you hear that, oh my God, this guy can row this speed on the ergometer. And you think, well, that's impossible. Like, I don't know, that is literally impossible. No one can do that. Or this person is like, you know, some kind of genetic freak. And then like somehow over time, like you get closer and closer, and then you start doing pretty well. And it's similarly, you know, when I started rowing, I wasn't thinking like, oh, I'm going to go to the World Championships and be a world champion, or I'm going to go to the Olympics. And I think that experience of having these things that are insurmountable and impossible, and yet by kind of putting in disciplined work day after day, chipping away, and also like running into roadblocks and somehow kind of bouncing up and getting going again. That's something that experience gives you confidence to kind of take on stuff. And I think if anything, I have a completely irrational confidence in myself, that I can do just about anything. And it's not true. Like, I know that's not true. And I have all kinds of, you know, but I think rowing, that was something that rowing gave me. And I think you learn just not to give up. I think you learn that, and that's a cliche thing, I suppose, but to really have this sense of like, hey, they're gonna have to kill me before I stop. I'm just gonna keep going.
Yeah.
And it's so many times in life you run into that thing where you're just like, oh, I am like struggling here, and this is a slog, and I'm not sure I can I have no idea how I'm going to get to the other end, but I know that the only way to do it is like take another stroke,
Mm.
like put one foot in front of the other.
We've been talking for over an hour now. I've got one more question.
Please.
Literally, I could talk for 10 hours with you, Chris. It's absolutely fascinating. I was lucky enough to see a letter, I think, that Bobby Mock, you must have seen it, had written to
Yep, Matt Deacon.
Matt Deacon, yeah. And I got it via Pete, actually, Pete Cipollone. And it was about the relationship between that crew, Boys in the Boat, subsequent to them winning the 36 Olympics. How close is your crew to having that?
I think we're a close group. I think the thing about rowing, and again, I'm sure it's the same with other sports too, but it's certainly true with rowing, is there are guys that you have rowed with, and I'm sure you have this experience too, Martin, guys you rowed with 25, 30 years ago, who you might not have seen for 10 years.
Yeah.
You see them, and within 10 seconds, it's like nothing's changed. And you know them. And I think what it is that rowing reveals who you are. If you're an asshole, people are going to know it. If you're selfish, people are going to know it. They're going to know your strengths and they're going to know your weaknesses. And you would yourself learn your weaknesses. Like you learn, wow, like I thought I could do that and it turned out I couldn't. Or I was really in one and this other person like basically dragged me through. And I think because of that, there's a bond and that we certainly have that from '04, but I have that with other groups too, other crews that I rode with. And that was such a cool letter to receive. But I think it's one of those things. It's like, the more things change, the more they stay the same. In that, I think if you got those guys together and sat down, and they might have like, I don't know what they would have been, the making blades and whatever technical thing they would have been doing and their training and their diet, whatever it was, but that would all be different. But, the question of like, well, do I want this guy in the boat with me? Like that's the same, and I'm guessing the profile of those guys, the psychological profile and who they are as people is really similar. I mean, I remember talking with the guys from who rowed for Yale in '56. They won a gold medal. And then, our boat in '04 was called the Rusty Whales. And there was a guy named Rusty Whales who'd rowed in '56 and in '60 and won gold medals in both Olympics. And when people would talk about this guy, Rusty Whales, they wouldn't talk about his strength or his technique or whatever. They would talk about, well, he was tough bastard, and he was kind, and he was a great teammate, and he was somebody who, lifted the group up. And when things were going crappy, he wasn't down in the dumps. He was figuring out, well, how do we get better? How do we, and I think those are the people that make or break your group. And it's also who you want with you. And so you hope that you can kind of be one of those people for somebody else, or you hope that the group looks at you and says, well, I'm glad Chris is here. And if that would be, if I could have somebody, I would hope that my teammates look back and say like, yeah, it was better that he was there as opposed to not. And that would be a great tribute and a great feeling.
That's amazing, Chris. It's been an incredible time, really, that we've spent together. I wish it could go on for more, but you've got things to do. I've got a few things I need to do. So we'll end the live part of this interview now. Everybody watching, Chris Ahrens, thank you.
Thank you, Martin. Take care.